Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Ready to take your seats? Well, as I said, good evening. My name is Alan Ronkin, and I am the Regional Director for the American Jewish Committee here in Washington, D.C. And we are delighted to have you here this evening as our guests for this very, very important panel. Before I begin, I just want to recognize Nicole Mazur, who's here, who really was the driving force for AJC anyway to make this happen. So thank you, Nicole, and my colleague Susan Sloan and Benji Rogers from AJC who are here. And I thought I saw Steve Gell. There he is. Steve Gell from our board, who is here as well. For those of you who don't know us, AJC is one of the United States' oldest human rights organizations. We are so proud to be involved in this work with you all, and it is really a privilege to have my colleague Felice Guerre here in Washington and to have an opportunity to hear her. So you don't want to hear me, so I'm going to turn over the microphone to Steve, who is the president here of the UN Association, but really just wanted to say thank you for coming. Welcome to AJC, and hope we have a wonderful and very informative evening.
Thank you very much. And you probably don't want to hear from me very long because I want to hear from the panel. I'm going to turn it over to Doug very shortly to do that. But welcome on behalf of the United Nations Association of the National Capital Area. How many of you are actual members of UNANCA? Great. But it looks like there's an opportunity to recruit and encourage more members. That's what I thought I would find out from that. And it's easy to do. First of all, Andrew Dahl, who is the head of operations and head of membership, is back there in the corner doing all the other yeoman's work that has to be done by any of us volunteers and small staff. So I hope very much that you consider that. It's the largest chapter of the United Nations Association of the United States of America, UNA-USA. It's one of 118 chapters, but we are actually the largest and probably equivalent to a great number of those overall, given it's the national capital area. We represent Virginia, D.C., and D.C., but it gives us a special opportunity and advantage to address critical global issues beyond what our constituency may be, but often our constituency is concerned and does daily work in this town with all of those agencies. So I'm particularly pleased that we have this opportunity. This is obviously a special time to be discussing and focusing on human rights issues, as it is always, but especially probably in this year and under some of the threats that we're experiencing. At the same time, some cheery things have happened. For example, while we were very dismayed and have worked with Felice Guerre, and she presented the special award from us this past year to the High Commissioner from Jordan, who recently completed his initial period of time. The fact that Michelle Bachelet has been appointed quite unanimously without lots of usual long-term process. That's a very positive event. And she comes running ahead of the curve, having been president twice of Chile, having helped develop Chile's own Human Rights Commission, having served as UN Women's head. So she's known to people, and she's an activist, we know that. And so she follows an extraordinary chief with another level of activism. I think that's a very positive affair. She started work on September 1, and much of what we want to talk about and be able to proceed in the years ahead is dependent highly on how well the Council does, with or without U.S. direct participation. The U.S. citizens are going to participate. That's what we're about. What we also want to do, though, is to recognize that this is, while focused today on Russia and on the rapporteur's reports and the report's review, we at UNANCAC, it's very important to have a series of events. We had one on China and focused in a similar fashion with a panel as distinguished. And today, Russia. And tomorrow, I would hope that we're going to be moving toward building a similar panel and review with a number of people on the recent report that was reviewed at the Council 2 sessions ago on the U.S. It's already a distinguished report because it's been highly criticized from the highest sources in the United States. Everybody should have a chance to make comment. But we as an institution representing the citizenship of the country want to make sure we take to heart those things that have been identified. The suggestion there's no poverty in the country, for example, or no inadequate justice is not a fact. And we know how to deal with faux facts. One of the facts is that there's terribly great injustice and poverty, which isn't of a concern to us from a human rights perspective. I want to thank Doug Wake, and I'm about to turn it over to him for his extraordinary work in bringing us together. He's the moderator. That sometimes looks like the least important role. Frankly, it's often the most important role, but more importantly, that he, with the help of Ed Elmendorf and several other members of our Human Rights Committee, put together the distinguished paper that we began to circulate at our annual meeting in June. And it's a very thorough backdrop to this conversation, and we're very fortunate to have that. We don't always have such a thorough backdrop and pre-published. It often happens the day before or day after. So thank you very much, Doug, for that leadership and for being able to circulate that over time. Doug has an extraordinary background of 35 to 40 years representing human rights, elections process, both for the State Department for a long term, where he also served as a representative in, I think, St. Petersburg and Moscow, and maybe one other place in Russia, before moving to Warsaw, though, with a different hat under the operations. I always say, you'll have to say OSCE. Okay, I get it. Where he also continues, no longer being the full-time representative in Warsaw, but continues, and he was just recently in Hungary this year overseeing, observing the elections process for the parliament. So he has a very distinguished background and recognition in that regard. Lastly, I just want to thank the Human Rights Committee of UNA, NCA, and there's several here. Heather Hill, who is the co-director, or director actually at the moment, chair of the committee, is in New York tonight, so she's not with us. Hence, I get the chance to say hello, welcome you, and turn this over to Doug to carry forward. Last thing I just want to mention, though, I mentioned I would say this because it could get me into trouble. We're in a town where there's a lot of discussion about collusion on the subject of Russia. A positive collusion is that 4 of the 5 members sitting before you all have their advanced degrees from Columbia University. That's a fortunate circumstance and a good indication of how important Columbia University is. You didn't get to do that because you weren't here for your education earlier. So we're so glad you're here and now part of this wonderful academic community. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to Alan and to Steve for the introduction, Steve particularly for the kind words, and Alan and the rest of the American Jewish Committee office here. Thanks very much for hosting us in this wonderful facility where I'm quite sure are holding the first, at least, large-scale event of the new year. So Happy New Year as well. I will try to be brief in my thank yous, given that others have already mentioned the role of the UNA-NCA Human Rights Committee, its volunteers, its office staff, Paul and Andrew in particular, but I'm very grateful for all of their support as well as that of Ed Elmendorf, who was mentioned as a driving force behind this event. Thanks mainly to those of you who came despite the hurricane warnings and probably didn't expect that rather than dodging hurricane, we were going to have to pull the blinds down because the sun was so bright in our eyes. Maybe this will change over the course of the next couple hours. But really, thanks to you for being here, and especially then to the panel members, who I'll introduce a bit later as each of them begins to speak. What I thought I would do is provide a few introductory remarks to kind of set the stage and highlight some key questions which are to be addressed before turning to the distinguished panelists and involving others in the question and answer session in our dialogue. So I'm really pleased to be moderating a session which draws together a couple of issues which have been of personal and professional interest to me over many years. One being the UN's approach to human rights, another, domestic developments in what is now the Russian Federation, and yet another, the role of Russia in multilateral institutions. Of course, we won't be able to undertake a comprehensive review of all these questions, and we certainly are not going to be able to dig deeply into every aspect of the human rights situation in the Russian Federation. That's a topic that deserves its own attention and gets a lot here in Washington. We also won't be able to deal with all of Russia's interactions with multilateral institutions that address human rights issues. Steve mentioned my own personal background working with the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which, even as we speak, is holding its annual 2-week human rights review session, the so-called Human Dimension Implementation meeting, where issues of human rights in the Russian Federation, in the United States of America, and in the other OSCE participating states are being hotly debated in 19 or 20 working sessions and 100 or so side events. And we also won't be able to go into issues like the work of the Council of Europe and the European Court of Human Rights, which addresses these questions on a more legalistic basis, including in the Russian Federation. We're going to look at the UN, and I've suggested to panelists that we have 3 broad areas that we can look at, and I'll just mention these questions, which at least one panelist told me she'll try to touch on each of. Some panelists may only touch on 1 or 2 of them. But question number 1 is how effectively different parts of the UN human rights system work in addressing the human rights situation specifically in the Russian Federation, both as a forum for discussing, transparently discussing what happens in the Russian Federation, and as vehicles for actually promoting positive change, for promoting better respect for human rights in the Russian Federation. So how does the UN actually address the specific issues in the country that we're talking about today? From a completely different perspective, how does Russia, as a member of the United Nations, use its diplomatic tools and its influence to affect the UN human rights machinery and the UN human rights agenda, not only as it addresses its own human rights situation, but globally? So this is sort of looking from the other side. One is, how does the UN affect or address Russia's human rights situation? The other side is, how does Russia exercise its influence and diplomatic power in shaping the agenda of the UN on human rights? A third issue is how this all looks, and this is really important, I think, coming from the UN Association, which is a non-governmental organization. How does civil society actors view all this process? How do they see the UN as a forum for addressing human rights? Maybe in comparison to other fora, maybe just objectively, how well do they think the UN does, and how transparent and open is it for them to work? And how civil society sees this other side of the coin, which is, how does civil society see Russia as an actor on the global human rights UN agenda? So that's 3 broad sets of questions, and it seems to me that it's particularly timely to be addressing all of them. Steve pointed out reasons why it's timely to be addressing human rights issues in the UN system. I would add that, although symbolic, of course, the fact that this is the 70th anniversary of the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights draws our attention to not only the text and the commitments and the standards in the UN in the Universal Declaration, but how effectively the machinery has developed to actually promote and encourage respect for human rights. Steve also alluded to the fact that the UN Human Rights Council is under quite a bit of scrutiny these days, and that's scrutiny that comes from many quarters, not only from the administration of this country, which has decided not to participate for the moment in the UN Human Rights Council, but the work of the Council is certainly something that always deserves critical review, and using Russia here more as a case study than anything else, I think we can get at some of these questions of how well the Council works. As far as Russia is concerned, maybe it's always timely to look at human rights in Russia, but it's also, I think, worth noting that when we talk about the UN system, nothing happens without Russia being very involved and very engaged. This was true of the Soviet Union in negotiations over the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights 70 years ago, and it's true on every resolution, every discussion in the UN system, even, I believe, while Russia is not a member of the UN Human Rights Council itself at the moment. So I think it's always important to look at Russia's role, and Russia as a diplomatic power obviously has a particular role as a permanent member of the UN Security Council as well, when certain human rights issues are elevated to that level. And I think here specifically in 2018 about the way in which issues like the situation in Myanmar with regard to the Rohingya, the situation in Syria have been addressed, or some have sought to address them through the UN Security Council, and what role Russia plays. Finally, with regard to the importance of Russia on this at this particular moment, there is a coincidence because there are periodic reviews of different things within the UN human rights system that take place every 3 years or every 5 years, and the coincidence right now in 2018 is that the UN's Universal Periodic Review process considered Russia during its May session through its working group. And in fact, a week from now, the plenary session of the UN Human Rights Council will look at the report from that, and that's something that's addressed a little bit in the paper that was mentioned, and that I hope speakers will have something to say about. Even more specifically, Russia was the subject this year of a review by the UN, by the Committee Against Torture established under the Convention Against Torture, the vice chair of which is sitting to my right. And that's something that doesn't happen all the time either. So combining those two issues, I think, will provide a particularly timely reason to be addressing this. I don't want to take too much more time before turning to the speakers. We'll just say that I think we have a great panel. I'll introduce each speaker before she or he speaks, and I hope that everyone has gotten a copy of this program with a more detailed set of biographies, so I won't go into great detail about each of our speakers. What I will say is that their expertise ranges across the questions that I mentioned in different ways. I think Ted Picona Brookings, who I'll introduce in a bit more detail later, probably has focused most on the institutional issues relating to the way the UN system works, where Natalia Arnaud of the Free Russia Foundation probably is going to be able to say more about the domestic human rights situation in Russia and how civil society views this whole process. Sarah Mendelson, now with Carnegie Mellon University, and Felice Guerre, who I'll turn over to in a moment, have decades of experience working kind of on both sets of issues. Both have worked inside the UN system, either as US government official or UN expert, but also from the non-governmental sector and the academic analytical perspective, have looked at the way that the human rights mechanisms has developed and the way that Russia has played in this process. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Felice. I've asked each speaker to take about 10 minutes. I've probably taken too much time myself already, but I think 10, 12 minutes we'll still be able to have good time for discussion, debate after the opening remarks. I may say a word or two. I may come back with a question or two before we open it up, but mainly I want to hear from our panelists and then from all of you. The last thing I say before handing over to Felice is we have a distinguished guest in the room who also has a role in the UN system, and that is a nice coincidence that he was able to be in town and to join us. Victor Madrigal-Boros, and I've probably mangled the name badly, is the independent expert of the UN Human Rights Council on protection against violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. Did I get it right?
You did.
A position which was established in a discussion where, again, the role of the Russian Federation was an important part of the equation, and one that speakers may have more to say about. We'll start with Felice Guerre, who I think I first met in the back of a basement conference room somewhere in Geneva, where there was something called the UN Commission on Human Rights, and Felice was representing one of the non-governmental organizations that had status, consultative status with the Economic and Social Council, and was able to speak at sessions, which I remember going to 11, 12, midnight, something like that, especially got to be about that time when they let the NGOs speak, right?
But spoke for 15 minutes.
But I was a junior diplomat with the U.S. delegation based in New York, but going to Geneva for these sessions. And Felice was already an expert and taught me some things about the way the UN system worked then, and I've followed her writings and her work over the years. As I say, the details are all here. I couldn't remember them all. They're distinguished posts in academic and legal affairs, and they're distinguished posts with the UN, including on the UN's Human Rights Committee, if I'm not mistaken, and the Committee Against Torture, where she's now the vice chair. And I think I will leave it at that and ask Felice to reflect on the questions that we've posed in the limited time, and be ready to address more questions as we get into the evening. Felice?
Well, thank you, Doug, and thank you, everyone, for joining us today. It's a really interesting question and a really great panel, so I'm looking forward, and a terrific audience. So I'm really looking forward to this discussion today. The first question that Doug asked us to address was, how has the UN provided the means to address human rights in Russia? And in order to understand that, you have to understand what the UN human rights system does in the human rights area at all. First thing it did is to identify what the norms are, because the UN Charter just says pay attention to human rights and non-discrimination on grounds of the 4 grounds cited. And it was those norms that were identified in the Universal Declaration and codified in treaties some years later have continued to sprawl and grow and be defined. The second thing that the UN does is sometimes to focus on implementation of those norms. And the implementation is expressed in one of 2 ways, either in law or edicts or policy statements of some sort, or by facts on the ground. Now, the UN Human Rights Program doesn't do anything different than the rest of the human rights experts and movement and organizations around the world, in the sense that what does it do? It monitors the facts and it reports on them. This is often called naming and shaming, but that's just a sort of a cute rhetorical phrase, because there's much more engaged in it. There's interpretation, there's review of law and of practice and interpretation. And what the UN's treaty bodies do, I mean, they're not really the UN's, because they're really the state parties' treaty bodies. Every country in the world is party to at least one of the major human rights treaties, and many are party to several, or if not all of them. And there are now 10 core treaty bodies that review reports, all except for one of them, reviews reports on the measures that a state that has ratified is actually taking to implement the obligations under the convention. There are optional procedures such as individual complaints. There are optional procedures such as inquiries to look at systematic abuse. But the one thing that all the states are required to do under the treaty system is to provide periodic reports on compliance. They don't use the word compliance in the UN, but that's what it's all about. Now, when The Human Rights Council was created in 2005 or 6. Both. The Secretary General, Kofi Annan, who you may have read, actually, Ghana had a formal ceremony today burying him after his unfortunate death a few weeks ago. Kofi Annan, who was behind the reform, said he wanted a procedure that would provide a comprehensive and objective review of countries, that would provide more effective assistance and better protection of human rights. And this is now called the Universal Periodic Review. It is universal in the sense that, to everyone's surprise, every country in the world has participated in this and put themselves up in front of their peers, that is to say, representatives of other governments, to have their human rights practices scrutinized, questioned, and to present a report and to discuss it with governments. It's called Universal Periodic Review because somebody didn't understand the English language. It started out as peer review. And, well, you know how things happen. And that's what Doug was talking about when he said Russia has just been through this Universal Periodic Review and now has to step forward and say which of the 315 recommendations it received from different countries during this review it will accept and which ones it will note. And so far, which means reject. In UN language, note in this context means reject. And so that's going to happen next week, so it's really quite an interesting moment. So what does the UN do about Russia? All the things I just described. It reviews reports at these 9 different treaty bodies. It has some individual complaint procedures. It has allowed the High Commissioner for Human Rights to visit some many years ago. And it has allowed a number of special procedure mandate holders like Victor to visit, not Victor though, not yet. And in truth, as the background paper shows you, about 15 special rapporteurs who deal with very pertinent subjects and very difficult subjects have asked to visit Russia, and they have not been allowed to visit, while rapporteurs who deal with issues like foreign debt, cultural rights,
The effect of sanctions.
and the effect, yes, and the negative effect of sanctions, of human rights sanctions on governments, have been allowed to visit. So we're seeing some problem here in getting access. The background paper tells you that there's never been a resolution dealing with Russia that affects its sovereignty or its internal matters. I'm not sure. Maybe it was only a decision, but I was definitely present when in 1995 there was an agreement brokered by the U.S. to allow a resolution, a soft resolution on Chechnya. And I believe there was also one in 2000 after Mary Robinson's visit to the region. And I think that may have been a resolution, but it's possible that there were decisions. So what does the UN do about Russia and human rights? It speaks up sometimes. And the sometimes is really where the whole game is. Now, the Committee Against Torture is very much like the Convention Against Genocide, which is also having a 70th anniversary this year, in that it deals with a single crime. But its approach to that single crime is not to prohibit the crime, because it was already prohibited under international law, but rather to establish a whole series of preventive measures that states need to take in order to diminish the possibility that torture will happen at all. And so the review of Russia that took place just a month ago was the 6th review by the Committee of Russia. And it started off with just 2 or 3 days before that, a videotape of the most brutal torture in Yaroslavl being released to the public by the lawyer of the victim, who had spent a year trying to work out a deal with the Russian authorities to publicize that, and who had failed. And so he released it 3 days, she released it 3 days before our committee reviewed Russia. Well, you can imagine this was the centerpiece of not just media attention, but of our inquiry with Russia. And what we focused in on was videotaping as a preventive measure. And the state said, well, we've solved we were really good. We had it videotaped, so we've been able to go out now. We found 15 people, just have to work at the same prison, and we've dismissed them, and we put some in jail already, and we've really done all the right thing. But as Doug has a copy of the article here, as the New York Times wrote, actually, this didn't show that the system worked or that there was prevention. On the contrary, it showed that the system didn't work because she had to leak the video in order to get responses. The government didn't use the video in order to do timely oversight that would have been protective. I raised the question at the time with the government about the 5 or 6 other very, very prominent cases of horrific torture that had been in the Russian media over the last 6 or 7 years since they last appeared. And I said, how can you, in each of those cases there was a big fuss and there were promises of things that would happen to bring people to account and to justice. And actually nothing much happened. So I said, what are you going to do to guarantee to us that in the Yaroslavl case something's going to happen? And I pointed, of course, to the Magnitsky case, the well-known Magnitsky case, and I pointed out that this was an exemplar of inaction, that this was a case that showed at every single point how the government deflected any action, and how to this day there's been no serious accountability in any way. In fact, they tried Magnitsky after he died and blamed him for other things. The way the committee works is we ask questions and we wait for the country to respond to those questions. We raise a lot of questions about fundamental legal safeguards. We ask questions about the harassment of human rights defenders. I raised questions about the domestic violence law, in which the government had willingly and publicly said, we're going to reduce penalties for domestic violence, sort of like thumbing their nose at the victims and at advocates. My colleagues raised questions about the attacks on lesbian, gay, bisexual, and trans persons in Chechnya. I also raised issues about hazing in the military, the practice in the Caucasus of bribe kidnapping, the law which is the government's law which is exculpatory if a rapist marries the person he rapes, then the penalties disappear, exculpatory law. We also asked a lot of questions about foreign occupation and extraterritorial application of the convention. Now, the government's responses on the record, in public, were there were no attacks on gays and lesbians in Chechnya because we have no cases. Nobody's come forward. Same argument that they made in the UPR. The government's response on the issue of domestic violence was, it it's not in your competence. It's not torture. It belongs under some other treaty. No answer to the question. The government's response on human rights defenders was, and reprisals against human rights defenders was, look, we signed up to this treaty 20 years ago, but if you want to bring other issues in that and you think they're relevant, that's your business. We're not going to answer because we don't have any obligations. These are classic responses to these concerns, and they are indicative of where the system is weak. The system is weak because the government says we didn't do it. We say you did do it. We have no policing authority, we have no executive authority, we have no capacity to compel the government to do anything. The only thing this UN body and all the other treaty bodies can do is issue comments, issue recommendations, and essentially call them out on that situation. Now, that gets you to this question of how does Russia use its diplomatic tools to influence human rights at the UN? One, it's a state party, and it regularly points to all of the privileges of not only of diplomats but of states, and it will always put down the independent expert, the special rapporteur, the NGO or other figure speaking, and say, you have no standing here. This is our club. We're the ones who have standing here. Secondly, Russia often comes into the treaty bodies and says, we support cooperation because we've submitted our reports and we've shown up. And that's all we need to do is show cooperation. In other words, compliance is an irrelevance. It's all about cooperation. This is another UN speak. Russia's gone so far as to say, in the context of this treaty reform effort that it led in 2012, it's gone so far as to say that even fact-finding investigations or early warnings by the treaty bodies is an abuse of the authority of these treaty bodies, which, by the way, are authorized to make their own rules of procedure. So they will challenge that. If it's not enough to say it's out of line, they will say they'll use the argument that the committee is wasting time, it's wasting its resources, it needs to be more efficient, or some of those kinds of very familiar arguments. The key thing that Russia did with regard to the treaty bodies was to take a reform effort out of the High Commissioner's office and insist that it be the subject of interstate discussion. So states, whether or not they sign the treaty, have now inside the UN the authority to determine how many languages things are translated into, how many pages you can write, they wanted to have the authority, as with the Universal Periodic Review, to veto who is the rapporteur or lead questioner for the country. They wanted to have the right to veto, to see questions in advance. They wanted to have the right to basically have the privileges of the Universal Periodic Review, but that hasn't been granted to them yet. What is the lesson from this? As far as using diplomatic tools to influence human rights at the UN, first of all, language is not what it seems. Treaty strengthening process clearly was a treaty weakening process, right. So they think the two words mean the same thing. The words adaptation, coordination, efficiency often mean something completely the opposite. The UN because the committees and the experts lack binding authority, the Russians are able to move beyond this. There is duplication through the Universal Periodic Review procedure. There is an effort to exhaust state parties in that process because there is no expert component. So these are weaknesses. Doug's asking me to wrap it up, and let me try to do it in a way that I hope you understand. So what is Russia's role in the UN when it comes to human rights? Is it a maker, a doer, a leader of issues? Is it a taker? It gets the benefit of what happens in human rights and training, cooperation, things of that sort? Or is it a breaker that comes in and submits 50 amendments when it doesn't like a resolution in order to take up the time, exhaust everybody, and hopefully defeat some of the top elements? Is it a breaker that clutters the agenda with issues that wouldn't be there otherwise, like traditional values, protection of the family? Its anti-Nazism resolution is directed explicitly at condemning the Baltic states. Is Russia a breaker in the sense that it brought up the traditional values resolution in order to oppose references to sexual orientation and non-discrimination on those grounds? Is Russia a breaker because it wants to see no protections for human rights defenders, and in fact to ensure that human rights defenders are not considered to have any particular rights, regardless of what they're doing? Is Russia a breaker because it has trivialized issues of domestic violence, or it has tried to tie special rapporteurs going on special country visits from actually carrying out their work? I think Russia has been a maker when it wants to be, and it's been a taker sometimes, training, things of that sort. It's, as I've indicated in my remarks, it's most definitely been a breaker, and I would argue it's actually also a faker. And I say that because in the background paper, we quoted the Vienna Declaration and Program of Action as citing the Russian delegates, I sat next to them, saying in 1993, human rights is a legitimate concern of the world community. We have taught people the wrong thing. Whereas today it is prepared to stand up and deny across the board. Civil society organizations know this. They've been disappointed. Russian civil society organizations have been disappointed in how the UN has responded to Russia, how the High Commissioner's Office and the Secretariat tiptoe around with regard to Russia. The field presence that existed in Russia didn't do much of anything, and now even that, which did human rights education, it's been closed by the Russians. Mechanisms can't be enforced, unlike the European Court of Human Rights, and human rights defenders are at risk if they cooperate with the United Nations, because they will be labeled foreign agents, and Russia has come trying to take their pictures and trying to do that. So in conclusion, is the UN for Russia what Moynihan said, a dangerous place? Or is it what Madeleine Albright said about the United States, indispensable? Is the United Nations for Russia a place where they can be a bad actor? Or is it for the United States a place where Russia is an opponent that must be engaged?
Elise, thank you for those very rich and detailed remarks. I love how you're able to bring in your personal experience from the work you've done in the UN system, including in the committee, and also take this analytical perspective with a nice, I think, fresh framework of makers and takers and breakers and fakers. At least I've not heard this before, and it gives a lot of food for thought. And it's probably very appropriate that we now turn to Ted Picone to reflect on similar related issues, because I think Ted, who is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and has worked both on deep analysis of the special rapporteur and UN expert system, on broader issues of international order, and has really thought deeply about the way the multilateral system works. I think can build on what we heard from Felice, looking at Russia as a case study, both as a subject, but I think probably particularly as a player that exerts its influence in the UN, on the human rights system of the UN. So Ted?
Sure, thanks.
Over.
Many thanks, Doug, for organizing us, UNA, NCA, and our co-hosts. I'm going to pick up on a few points that Felice raised and then go from there and make some comparative points regarding some other key players at the UN. Felice is absolutely right that the UN system is weak, the UN human rights system in particular, because it's what states want to make of it. And it's a question of state willingness to cooperate with the very mechanisms that they themselves have established. There's always this charge that, the UN is imposing on our intervention, but it's the states themselves that have actually created the Human Rights Council and all these treaties and other bodies. So we have to consider that. Sometimes it works, and I've done a lot of documentation of when, in particular, special rapporteurs and commissions of inquiry have actually really had impact at the national level. I'm not an expert on Russia per se, but that is coloring my look at this subject. But I want to start by doing something a little different, which is to step back and say it's not just about the UN. Sometimes there are bilateral mechanisms that are particularly important. And Felice mentioned the case of Sergei Magnitsky. And I think since we are here in Washington, it's important to point out that Russia's difficult human rights record at home, and that case in particular, has had a dramatic effect on human rights internationally in at least one way, which was due to the mistreatment and the death of Mr. Magnitsky, who was an anti-corruption tax accountant uncovering some massive fraud. He died in a Russian jail in 2009. We have something called the Global Magnitsky Human Rights Act, Accountability Act, which was adopted by Congress in 2016. And this built on a previous act that was just focused on Russia in 2012. But it's now being used by the Trump administration with a very aggressive, I would say, approach through an executive order that President Trump signed last December that has imposed sanctions for human rights violations and acts of corruption on dozens of individuals, including in Russia, but elsewhere. The former president of the Gambia, the former, the chief military commander in Myanmar responsible for the atrocities against the Rohingya Muslims, the daughter of the former president of Uzbekistan. I mean, this is a path-breaking way that complements what happens at the UN system. So I did want to put that out there since I think it's particularly relevant to this subject. So at the UN, I would like to look at Moscow's behavior by comparing it with that of Beijing. And I think that's important because in our geopolitical moment we're living in right now, we are seeing China and Russia cooperating more and more. And we just saw it this week with military exercises, which brought China much closer into the operations of these military exercises. And I think we're seeing more and more coordination and cooperation among these two powers in a way that's very much pushing back against the international human rights system, against U.S. leadership, and what we call the international liberal order. So I think that's the context. I've been working on the subject of China's role at the UN, and I'm coming out with a paper next week on the subject that documents in some detail how China is moving ahead beyond just this more traditional defensive posture into a more aggressive behavior, and is very much in alignment with Russia as it does so. So you see a lot of similarities in their voting behaviors and vocal support for each other's resolutions and their arguments against the international human rights system, but there are some important distinctions. So Russia, did have this period of democratization after the fall of the Soviet Union. The quote that Doug referenced from the Vienna Conference is a great example of that reflection on the part of Russia, but that time has come and gone. But one example of Russia, how Russia's different, it does have an accredited national human rights institution, which China does not. So that is one way in which human rights activists in Russia can raise human rights problems at the national level. Of course, it's a member of the OSCE, so it is subject to human rights and election monitoring by fellow member states. It did accept an OHCHR advisor to work in Moscow for 10 years on technical assistance, human rights education, to carry out joint projects, but as Felice mentioned, that is no longer there. Now, China has never been subject to any of these measures, interestingly. Since the Human Rights Council was established in 2006, the Council has never adopted a country-specific resolution on China, nor has the UN General Assembly. It's not a member of any regional organization with the human rights monitoring mandate. It certainly never accepted an OHCHR advisor or field presence. Now, you've seen this in both countries, I would say, a deteriorating record on respect for human rights, with President Putin and Premier Xi Jinping really taking a very hardline approach to domestic critics and independent monitors. But interestingly, it was Russia that lost election to the Human Rights Council when there was competition for a seat from the Eastern European bloc. So the election to the Council is done by regional blocs, and usually it's a clean slate. So whoever is there on the list gets elected. But in that case, that year, Russia lost the vote, which for a P5 member was a big deal, and I think really surprising. Now, most people say it was because of Russia's material support to Bashar al-Assad's brutal crackdown in Syria. Interestingly, China routinely receives the highest, or at least among the top 3 number of votes when they get elected to the Human Rights Council. There's another important distinction, and I think it says something about China's fairly successful positioning at the UN and its growing economic and political power in the world. China takes a very hard line on any country-specific scrutiny at the UN on human rights issues, and it will block every single resolution in that vein. And this, of course, especially after the events in Tiananmen Square. It has lost that fight. There are country-specific resolutions. There are naming and shaming condemnatory resolutions all the time at the Human Rights Council and at the at the General Assembly. But, of course, it has won the battle of avoiding scrutiny of its own record. That's not the case with Russia. There is a UN General Assembly resolution condemning Russia's violations in Crimea. I don't know if Sarah's going to speak to that, so I won't say more about that. So China, beyond this defensive posture, is now sponsoring for the first time its own resolutions that introduce some of their kind of Chinese principles or the interpretation of international human rights norms. And you see language like that sound quite benign, like mutually beneficial cooperation and issues of right to development. But these are really vehicles to reshape international human rights principles and mechanisms. And they are meant to uphold the Chinese model of state-party control as somehow consistent with international human rights norms. Now, Russia is not a member of the Council, as I said right now, but Russia stands with China on each and every one of these tactics. And they do it through written statements, they do it through their voting, they do it through something called the like-minded group. These are states that are dedicated to weakening the international human rights system and blocking any kind of scrutiny. And these are countries like Egypt and Cuba, Venezuela, Pakistan, but also, I have to say, some democracies like India and Indonesia regularly vote with the like-minded group. So we have a problem. We have a problem here in building the kind of cross-regional coalition that you need to make the mechanisms work. It's not always a problem. Sometimes these things get through. Of course, we know about what's happening at the UN Security Council. I don't know if you are going to speak to that, so I won't say much about it. But of course, on Syria, Russia and China have exercised their veto to block any serious action by the Security Council on Syria, and the result is just great tragedy for the Syrian people. Now, when human rights and responsibility to protect civilians is mainstreamed into, say, a peacekeeping resolution, then we see consensus. But when the argument for saying Security Council has to act because human rights is a threat to international peace and security, you see them immediately shut that down. And we just saw this week when the U.S. Nikki Haley tried to insert Nicaragua on the agenda of the UN Security Council, very much explicitly making that argument that human rights violations lead to threats to international peace and security, that Chinese and Russians blocked it. They're doing other things together. They're cutting the budget of UN human rights positions, including in UN peacekeeping missions. They are working together at the UN NGO Committee, which accredits NGOs' participation at the UN. They're blocking civil society participation there, particularly for organizations that they don't like. Now, just a couple very short final words. The report that Doug did is very helpful in looking at some of the details. I won't get into all the data, but we do see on UPR, again, some similar behavior where Russia and China do accept some of the recommendations. It's not a universal negative approach, but they also manipulate the system, and they get their friends to praise them when it's their turn to take the podium. They have been quite selective in which rapporteurs to invite into the country, pretty weak records there. And they do not have a standing invitation to those special rapporteurs, but neither does the United States. Now, the United States has accepted, I have to say, they have a much better record of accepting special rapporteurs. And we'll see if that changes under this administration, especially after the poverty report. Lastly, on substance, Russia is inserting some of these principles that are meant to, as Felice talked about, fight against the Sogi mandate by talking about the rights of the family, the rights of the elderly, the rights of humankind, and contribution of humankind to these kinds of issues. So I think that's something to watch. They sometimes win those votes, sometimes they lose them. But I think China is learning something from Russia's behavior and going beyond it. And I think we should expect to see more and more of that, the two of them working very closely together to weaken the UN human rights system. Thank you.
Thanks, Ted. Those were really helpful comparative perspectives, bringing in the China angle as well as focusing in on some of the very specific things that both Russia and China are doing within the system, as you described it, mainly to distract and weaken, but also to enhance their own positions. Sarah Mendelson, I don't think we met as early as I met Felice, but we go back a ways too, and the connections involve both work on human rights issues and And on Russia, I think probably we first came across each other when you were doing some think tank or academic work on Russia and democratization when I was engaged in some assistance work for the former Soviet states. But we've seen each other working in parallel and sometimes in different places, both on these multilateral issues, particularly human rights issues, as well as Russia. Sarah has a very distinguished list of institutions with which she's been associated over the years. I would say, as an academic, as a think tanker, as an activist, as a doer, and much later than I got into the business, also as a U.S. government official in the last administration as our ambassador to the Economic and Social Council, which involved responsibility also for dealing with quite a few of these human rights issues, and probably on a pretty regular basis dealing with colleagues from the Russian Federation and its partners in the council. Sarah, I think we'll probably have something to say about a number of the issues that have already been addressed, and we'll bring in some new ones. And I'll hand over now to you.
Thank you, Doug, and thank you to the organizers and our hosts for being here. You probably heard the purest analysis from Felice, and then you heard terrific expert analysis from Ted. I'm going to be either pure, I'll be fully expert, but relying in part on personal up-close observation, both, you're right, from a researcher and academic perspective, as well as from being at the UN. But I have to say that my comments in part will start off negative and get more negative, and then I'll end up in a positive place. But I very much recommend and associate myself with a recent article about our friend Zaid, who left the Human Rights Council in a position. Most recently, it was in Prospect, and it's a tough read, but I think it is really capturing the crisis that we're in, and I want to end with an idea of how I think we can get out of this crisis. So I took your questions seriously, but I'm not necessarily going to answer them in the way that the order that they came. They sort of blend and go back and forth, and I'm also going to blur some of the boxes between human rights and humanitarian, because I think we're in a real crisis there. My formative experience in all of this really comes from the second war in Chechnya, where at the time I was both an academic at the Fletcher School and then a think tanker at CSIS, and tracked it really closely and wrote on basically the anatomy of failure that the international community just failed to respond repeatedly. And why this matters goes well beyond Chechnya. You saw in the second war of Chechnya, the first time the Russians are targeting civilians with total impunity and targeting humanitarian assistance. And it's that erosion of norms and that lack of response that I think helps drive in part Syria. Now, I'll circle back to that in a second, but I saw it at the UN starkly when, I don't think people track this that much, but in 2016, the Secretary General was really trying to lead a paradigm shift in how humanitarian assistance was delivered. What the system as it's built is really a kind of supply side arrangement where agencies in New York or elsewhere will ask for the money, as opposed to demand-driven and understanding what the needs are of people on the ground. I would argue this has helped drive the refugee crisis that we were responding to. But concretely what happened is there was an excellent document called One Humanity Shared Responsibility that came out in January 2016 that laid the groundwork for a possible paradigm shift. And that was going to be followed in May 2016 by the World Humanitarian Summit. And about 60 days out from the World Humanitarian Summit, many member states started to basically indulge in a kind of not invented here attitude. And Russia, you have these sort of pro forma events where countries come and they thank the Secretary General for his efforts, and we're looking forward to seeing you in, it was in Turkey, but I can't remember where exactly it was. In any case, The Russians went as far as to issue a joint resolution with Egypt denouncing the entire World Humanitarian Summit, behavior that was really outside UN norms, but also, I would say, foreshadowing a rude intervention by the Russian DPR delivered in the UK to the UK and the Security Council not long ago. So that's all kind of UN theatrics. What it is kind of masking or shading are the multiple, the 12 UN vetoes that Russia has engaged in the Security Council on the most damaging, dreadful use of force that I would say we've seen in the post-World War II era. In a time when we actually have, I had one of my students here, we went to the Holocaust Museum last week to see the exhibit looking at what Americans knew about what was going on in World War II and the genocide. And we know, we can see, we see it every day. It was even shown in the Security Council, and yet the veto happens and happens and happens, and there's seemingly no response. Now, to shift a little bit, the way in which the Russians are looking at this, they see March 1999, there's a decision by NATO to bomb in Kosovo, and there's some that argue that that was the time when the Russian government decided initially to map out plans for the second war in Chechnya. That the Russians come to this in a way with the understanding or belief that there is no international humanitarian law and that this is all a farce. The Libya vote in the Security Council in March 2011, I hear from lots of Russia analysts, was a moment where Putin was, number one, furious with Medvedev, who had agreed to an abstention by the Russians. And that laid the groundwork for Putin returning to the presidency. If you'll recall that in September 2011, they announced they were switching places. But it also led to the first veto by the Russians in October 2011 on the Syrian front. My sense is, and this is my analysis, that Putin, when he saw the UN Security Council move on Libya and use force in Libya, they weren't going to allow that to happen in Syria, so that's what's driving it. Now, you could argue that I think Russia, the most surprising moment of my entire UN experience was the result of that Human Rights Council vote, where Russia did not win. That was a real, there's a gasp in the General Assembly kind of thing. And that, passes for sort of high drama in the UN. I would argue that that is what cost the Russians their seat, is that multiple. If there's just, by the time we got to fall 2016, the feeling of the General Assembly was so annoyed by the Russians that, in fact, the Canadians, along with Liechtenstein, took the Syria issue to the General Assembly out of the Security Council because they were so irritated. In a less high drama, a less, I would say, generally violent area is the closing space around civil society, and I'm sure you're going to talk more about this. So just a few quick anecdotes. You should understand this is not just about Russia. Since 2012, according to the International Center for Non-for-Profit Law, 72 countries have passed or enacted 140 plus restricted laws constricting civil society space. And I would argue that it is reflected or parallel to your mandate. You could argue, as I have, that it began in part in Russia and has spread everywhere else. The NGOs that I worked with, non-Russian NGOs in Russia over 2.5 decades, working to try and support human rights in Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union, including the National Democratic Institute, who I worked for, the MacArthur Foundation, the Ford Foundation, the Open Societies Foundation. All are gone. Some left because they were labeled undesirable by the Russian government. Others left because I think they viewed there was no enabling environment. Russian organizations like the Levada Public Opinion companies, survey company, Memorial, all labeled foreign agents. So imagine my surprise when my staff came to me and said, okay, so the NGO committee, which we sit on, is overseen by the NGO branch. And for whatever reason, the Russians think that they have their slot is to run to be the NGO branch chief. And the person that they're proposing is the same guy from Moscow who puts together the list of foreign NGOs that are listed as undesirable. So I'm like, wait a second, you're telling me the Russians are trying to insert this guy who makes up the list, and then he's going to oversee the NGO committee. So immediately emails, phone calls to our like-minded. We immediately run across the street to marching right and left to an undersecretary who's Chinese, who says to us, this is of no interest to anyone. I'm not going to raise this. This is totally trivial. To which I said, well, we're taking this to the Secretary General. I'm pretty positive our firm rep is going to be supportive of this, and you're not going to hear the last of it. In the end, it worked. But it worked as long as somebody's really paying attention and spending a lot of time on that kind of stuff. So, to your point about how Russia is working inside the UN, there's no question there's a lot of strategizing and good work making sure things they don't want to happen. And so we energized, we then said, okay, let's find a campaign to get an NGO accredited and show how you can actually, on our side, work together to get somebody through it. We had the Committee to Protect Journalists volunteer sort of as a guinea pig to work the system. Long story short, they got accredited, but we had to take the vote out of this 19-member body, the NGO committee, which has Venezuela, China, Cuba, Russia, but also India, South Africa, a lot of countries that are have a democratic tradition but are voting to close down space and not let NGOs get accredited. We knew we wouldn't make it through the ECOSOC, to the NGO committee, but we take it to the full ECOSOC, 54 member states. And we did our sort of tracking, and we decided we'd have enough votes, and in fact, it went through. So again, you can strategize. But we get to the country-specific resolution. I just happened to have the voting record from 2016 because we spent supporting our Ukrainian brothers and sisters an enormous amount of time to work this country-specific resolution. And what does that mean? It means that if anybody who's worked on the Hill trying to get a bill through, you got to know where your members are and who's with you and who's against you. So this is 193 member states trying to figure out who's yes, who's no, who will abstain, and who will be willing to stay out of the room when the vote happens. And what is this about? This is about the situation of human rights in the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol. Now, this is about Russians invading Ukraine. And what are the results? After huge amounts of work, 73 yes, no 23, which sort of counts as a victory, but we had 76 abstaining and 23 absent. On like the most basic premise of human rights and international law. And I looked up last year's vote, and apparently my colleagues lost 3 votes. So the no votes went up, and the yeses went down. I mean, this is clearly a very serious problem. This leads me to think that, in fact, the civil society community, like on many issues, is totally split. And to really know, you'd have to do a nice survey of how rights activists versus others are understanding the system. My sense is generally there's a group that feel it's still important to work the UN system and to get access, and they're a frustrated lot. And then there's a group that says this UN system, there's a whole world of human rights that lives outside the UN system. And so we spend our time there. Regardless of how you view all this, there is a crisis that civil society is thinking about all the time, and that is this closing space around civil society, which when it happens, generally, there's a shrug or a sigh, or there's no response at all. This is causing civil society organizations around the world to feel that there's a crisis of legitimacy and resilience on behalf of their organizations. So how do we address that issue? And this is my final positive point. You might recall, as you will, that 3 years ago, this month, 193 member states remarkably agreed to a new agenda, the Sustainable Development Goals. This is an agenda that is got rights woven into it. I would say my friend, colleague Suzanne Nessel has written that we should come up with some superhuman rights goals, but I would say let's get the goals that are in there, particularly that involve rights. Let's make sure people know about them. Let's get people trained up in delivering them, and let's make sure everybody remembers that they're there. I clustered them into three. There's the MDG plus goals, climate plus goals, and the 16 plus goals, the goals that are really about a peaceful, just, inclusive society that include reducing all forms of violence. There's work on corruption. There's work on combating human trafficking. And I see these as a potential way of broadening constituencies for human rights, and that we should bear down on these. And the last thing I'll say is that I'm very seized with the idea that they're particularly appealing to the up-and-coming generation, what we call Cohort 2030. And I'd like to think that we have representatives of Cohort 2030 in the room. And if you want to know more about Cohort 2030, ask me.
Thanks, Sarah. Another rich presentation, and I want to thank you particularly for ending on a positive note, despite a pretty long list of pretty significant problems. And I want to get to Natalia in 1 second, but you did remind me of something which I guess has both a positive and a negative aspect. In those days when I was a junior American diplomat in New York, I once actually sat on that NGO committee, the committee that vetted non-governmental organizations to determine whether the committee would recommend to the Economic and Social Council that they be given consultative status. And although the administration in power in the United States at the time was the Reagan administration that was quite heavily criticized by many NGOs on things like refugee and asylum policy. Is anyone hearing echoes here? Mm-hmm. That administration in New York took the position that serious, responsible NGOs should have this status regardless of whether they happen to be critical of the United States administration. There was one which at the time was called the Lawyers Committee for Human Rights. Subsequently, years later, became Human Rights First, and its head actually at one point became the Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights and Humanitarian Affairs. But I remember spending a quite unpleasant week not succeeding in getting further with that candidacy, although a number of countries, including the United States, which were subject to criticism, were willing to have that criticism in the system. There was a majority at the time, and anyway, it was a consensus-based body of countries which included the Soviet Union, but also included a number of Latin American countries that were at that time not led by democratic regimes, that said that this NGO seemed to be doing very interesting work and it should be studied further and put on the agenda for the next year. So it's a positive element. You actually managed to get something through that was the subject of efforts to block. But this gets us right to the subject of civil society, and Natalia Arnaud is president of the Free Russia Foundation, which is a nonprofit, non-governmental organization that focuses on events in Russia, not only on human rights issues, as far as I understand, but in particular on human rights issues. And Natalia herself has worked these issues not only here in the U.S., but when she was in Russia, she's also had a role with the International Republican Institute for International Affairs that, as many of you in the room know, has, along with the National Democratic Institute, which Sarah worked for at some point in Moscow, have, on really a nonpartisan or bipartisan basis, worked to promote democracy and human rights in many countries, not least among them Russia. So, Natalia, I hope you'll be able to say something about how people from the civil society community view this relationship between Russia and the UN system, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Doug, for inviting me to speak at this event and with such distinguished panelists. It's more valuable learning experience for me rather than a speaking opportunity. I've been involved in the democracy promotion and the fight for human rights in Russia for 14 years now, including almost 4 years of working at the Free Russia Foundation, which I established in December of 2014. The topic of human rights and Russia, or rather a lack of human rights in Russia, or very often an absence of human rights in Russia, is very familiar to me. This is something I know very well on my own experience. In 2012, my son and I were deprived of a basic human right to live in our own country. As Doug and Sarah mentioned, I used to work for the International Republican Institute for 10 years, and together with many other organizations, we first of all were labeled as undesirable organizations, but also the Russian government at some point decided that work for such international organization is considered as state treason, so I was threatened to be in jail for 20 years. I had 48 hours to pack and leave instead of spending these 20 years in a Russian jail, so here I am now. Very grateful to the US for accepting me. The subject of Russia at the UN is less known for me, or actually was less known to me until this panel. Now, after this great lecture by Felice and outstanding comparative analysis by Ted, and just really outstanding experience story of Sarah, I think I feel like I know 90% more about the UN operations. And actually, for many Russian human rights and democracy defenders, UN is a very complicated structure with quite unclear procedures. I asked many of my partners and colleagues about their interaction with UN. A few of them said zero, a few of them said little, but most of them said not enough. So my own experience includes my participation at the World Summit of Women Leaders at the UN office in Geneva in 2009, two awareness campaigns about the true nature of Putin's regime on the eve of Putin's speech at the UN in 2015, and also same year awareness campaign about Russia's direct involvement in military actions in eastern Ukraine. It was a year when very good friend and colleague Boris Nemtsov was assassinated, and we helped his colleagues to finish his last project, finish this report, Putin War, which we also presented at the UN. And also we were involved in an advocacy campaign to release Nadia Savchenko, a Ukrainian female pilot who was captured by Russian-backed separatists in eastern Ukraine, handed over to the Kremlin, and was spent almost 2 years in a Russian jail. And that advocacy campaign included many briefings at the UN for different UN missions, a meeting with Samantha Power and US mission at the UN, and we worked very closely in cooperation with the Ukrainian mission at the UN. And also for about 8 months we were working on the petition to the UN working group on arbitrary detentions, and so it was a very valuable experience. We also checked the UN mechanism if we could initiate the international investigation of Boris Nemtsov's assassination, but unfortunately both UN or OSCE mechanism couldn't be initiated. So we're glad that at least this international oversight of Nemtsov's murder is at least at the Parliamentary Assembly of Council of Europe, where they appointed a special rapporteur on Nemtsov's murder case. Of course, I'm aware about the participation of many Russian NGOs in the UPR proceedings, and about an outstanding speech of Vladimir Karamurza at the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva last July regarding Alexei Pichugin, the longest-serving political prisoner in Russia, who is now in jail for 15 years when the Kremlin started its attack on the Yukos. And of course, the most vivid example was the recent time when the materials provided by Russian NGOs were reflected in the documents issued by the UN bodies
this you gave this great example about Evgeny Makarov, so we are very grateful for this. But still, I'd say that Russian civil society organizations and activists are much more often in Europe at the place or European Parliament sessions and meetings, and in Strasbourg and Brussels, and at the OSCE HDA meeting, which is taking place now, as you pointed out, or using mechanism of the European Court of Human Rights. Yes, actually, as you might know, Russia is the leader at the European Court of Human Rights on the number of claims against Russia submitted by Russian people. Turkey has the second place, but number of claims against Russia is at least 2.5 times higher. And in both the US and Europe, we pro-democracy Russians more interact with legislators on the issue of sanctions, for example. For example, this week I've been hosting Marina Litvinenko from Monday until a few hours ago. As you might remember, she's the widow of Alexander Litvinenko, poisoned with polonium in London in 2006. The case was again very much discussed in 2016 when the British court gave its verdict, when Lugavoy and Kovtun were officially recognized as murderers of Litvinenko, and when Putin for the first time was mentioned in legal documents, and as possible connection to this case, and obviously it was a very important verdict to show that Russia is connected to this terrorist attack, I would say. And it became even again more discussable after Novichok attack on Skripal last March, and actually very, very recent news of yesterday when we heard that there is a possible poisoning of Petr Verzilov in Moscow, who is the linchpin of Pussy Riot, and who recently made this great performance during the World Cup, during the final match, and so he has absolutely the same symptoms as Vladimir Kormozak had, lost his sight, and so same type of poisoning. So I tried to answer this question, how the Russian civil society interact with the UN, and while there are these positive examples of such interactions, it's still not enough. And just in the last 10 years, there were only 15 urgent appeals sent to the Russian government by the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detentions. Again, with the number of political prisoners in Russia, it's obviously like really not enough. But of course, Russian human rights and democracy defenders constantly monitor and attentively watch public UN sessions. And we'll watch, for example, this extraordinary session of the Security Council right after Novichok attack in Salisbury, sessions on Ukraine, on Syria, and so on. What we Russian speakers noticed is what an aggressive and rude language Russian UN representatives use, with Nebenza and Safronkov being the champions of that. You at least mentioned about the language a little bit, but it's really important to point out it's almost not noticeable for non-speakers of Russian that because the translation doesn't even express all the nuances of the language the Russian representatives use. It's actually not even a standard Russian. It's a mixture of criminal slang and prison jargon, and many expressions that Nebenza and other Russian UN representatives use, they are even untranslatable into English or any other language. It's really impossible. We tried, but we really gave up. So they really sound and behave like mobsters and thugs, and we thought, why do they do it if like the international community doesn't understand it? But then just we understood they do it for domestic consumption, and what Nebenza says or all other representatives, it's very extensively quoted in the Russian media, official media, and they are portrayed in Russia as fierce defenders of Russian values and interests against this cynical West with its hypocrisy and double standards. And just a few examples. Again, it's not that translatable. Like, Like, the UK on the slide is engaged in the systematic destruction of real evidence of what happened in Salisbury. Listen, you champions of philanthropy, why did you suddenly imagine that you have an exclusive right to lecture us on humanity and freedom of speech? Or Safronkov told to UK Representative Matthew Rycroft, it's because you're scared, you've lost your sleep about this. Don't look away. Why are you looking away? You insulted Syria, Iran, Turkey, other countries. Don't you dare to insult Russia ever. And here again, it's not only this language, it's also this use of personless, how yes, all the gestures, but also the use of this personal pronoun you, which really, like, again, only Russian speakers will understand that it's with the aim to insult, to show superiority. As for the Russian behavior at the UN, it's actually the same as everywhere else. Russia is one of the main disruptors in the world. We were talking about maker, breaker, and all that. Russia is the biggest disruptor in the world, including at the international institutions. It constantly violates international laws, agreements, but it also doesn't observe domestic legislation, including the constitution. So if Russia doesn't respect human rights inside Russia, and more now beyond Russia, why would it be a civilized actor at the international stage and international organizations? So we also see the tendency that maybe during the first half of Putin's rule, and he's ruling now for 2 decades, maybe even as the first quarter, the Kremlin at least cared about its international image a little bit. And now they don't even pretend they care. And about image, about international laws, norms, practices. Looks like the Kremlin is reveling its image of a mobster. Well, I spoke already about their language and behavior, and another fact that you all mentioned about this UPR procedure. And again, it seems that 2009, at least Russia treated it a little bit more seriously. It had a large delegation, tried to convey a message that Russian laws guarantee all rights, and that murder of journalist Anna Politkovskaya, Anastasia Babulina, that it's just crimes and Russian state doesn't have to do anything with it. Then Crimea happened, Ukraine happened, the murder of Boris Nemtsov happened, Syria campaign, election meddling, and last year, 2017, Russia behaves accordingly in the UN as well. Criticized the report on Crimea written by the Ukrainian mission, saying that Ukraine doesn't have any right to evaluate the situation in Crimea because it's a Russian territory. Russia called this report illegitimate. Russia called the UN report on Syria a politically biased fake, a clumsily fabricated report. Alexei Borodavkin, Russian representative in Geneva, said so. He also said it became fashionable to trade Russophobic lies. In 2018, again, when the UN countries asked Russia about the situation in Crimea, the situation with human rights, with freedom of speech, with about this law on domestic violence, censorship and blocking many websites, persecution of LGBT and all that. Russia reported that the Russian constitution guarantees Russian people freedom of speech and prohibits censorship, and that since the previous report, Russia conducted liberalization and humanization of the criminal legislation. Minister of Justice Konovalov said there is no discrimination in Chechnya. Gays, as there are no gays there, so since they are non-existent, they cannot be discriminated. You pointed that out. And he also said that NGOs with foreign agent status continue operating with no problems in Russia, and that the law on domestic violence didn't lead to increase of domestic violence, which again all our statistics show absolutely different. So everything is wrong and everything is just a lie. So the West treats Russia as a legitimate successor to the Soviet Union, Putin as a legitimate president of Russia, Russia as a legitimate member of various international organizations. But Russia treats the West as an enemy. It's not oversimplification. Everything is a warfare for the Kremlin, disinformation warfare, hybrid warfare. military campaigns, or soft or other sharp power campaigns, and all other possible elective measures in the West. The UN is just one of the battlefields for Russia, for Putin's Russia. And where it has a very strong ally, China, you already pointed out, is that Russia and China successfully cooperating in curtailing human rights advocacy, targeting funding for UN human rights programs, barring human rights defenders from participating in UN sessions and meetings, and putting pressure on smaller countries to go in the same manner as Russia and China, and so on and so forth. So for this past 2 decades of Putin's rule, I have seen my country has lost a lot of its heritage that it was always known for, this top scientists, world-class athletes, dancers, writers, great thinkers, and I really hate that what we've become is all these days is aggressors, hackers, election meddlers. So it begs the question of how the UN and other organizations and governments should interact with Russia. Should it be treated as just a tough partner, or should Russia be viewed as a proud state? And with all this position, and you also mentioned about engagement, but was this engagement successful? Did it lead to anything nice? For Putin, he just treats engagement as a weakness and as an opportunity to skirt international norms without fear of serious consequences. And, so the UN has largely decided to engage with Russia on most matters, and with Russia having a permanent seat at the Security Council and for veto rights, the UN has limitations of what it can do, but maybe some suggestions. At least use your voice as an arbiter for human rights to call out Russia when it houses nearly 200 political prisoners and at least 65 Ukrainians in Russia. And it actually includes Oleg Sentsov, a Ukrainian filmmaker, who is now for 123 days on a hunger strike. He's really dying, and he's dying. His hunger strike not about himself, not about his freedom. It's about the freedom of all other 46 Ukrainian political prisoners. So it's great to have reports, post-factum reports, unfortunately very often post-mortem reports, but maybe again we can do something right now. We can maybe save his life right now. Again, just coordinating all the efforts with all these different international organizations, international community, and just put pressure on the Kremlin, at least sound loud, at least so that we don't regret that we haven't done enough. My foundation worked a lot with Vladimir Karamurza and others on this great effort to rename the square in front of the Russian embassy in the memory of the slain Russian opposition leader Boris Nemtsov. It's now called Nemtsov Plaza. I don't want to start another advocacy campaign to ask governments to have Sentsov Plaza. Really, it's too much. Secondly, also it's this issue of how Russian civil society views the UN and other Western institutions. And so while there are some experienced advocacy organizations, it's also very important to teach how to use all that. Again, give more knowledge, what can be done. Really, there are a lot of things you mentioned I didn't even know existed, though I'm in this field for many, many years, not speaking about many regional NGOs that don't even know that there are such opportunities. So it's very important to train, to share knowledge, and so that, again, just so that they can learn basic skills on how to find greater public acceptance for their communities and their causes. And finally, it's very important for the UN and for any other institution or organization or government to clearly understand what Putin's Russia is, and to have this in-depth understanding that it's just not a partner, unfortunately. I tried to count how many vetoes Russia did lately. I came to 23rd, I got tired. I see how much, again, disruptive Russia is everywhere. How many gongas it sends everywhere. How many gongas it right now at this HDIM meeting, it's more and more they're trying again to meddle, to exhaust, as you said, and even with us, we published an article, actually just translated an article by another Russian activist, exiled activist, who investigated how Rothenberg, who is very close to Putin, how he circumvents Western sanctions through Cyprus, through the Czech Republic. And so we translated it, posted on our website. Very soon, the Czech law firm hired by Rothenberg sends a lawsuit against us. So again, we are a small organization, but we have to spend our resources to answering all these legal questions and spend our resources, time, and valuable time on that. And so again, thank you. I really can't wait for Q&A session.
So, the moderator acknowledges that he has allowed each of the speakers to shamelessly go beyond their allotted time. But he did so because each had really interesting things to say. Natalia, you started very modestly by suggesting that you actually didn't know much about this topic. And apart from the very heartfelt comments you made about your country and about substantive issues, you also did highlight quite a number of engagements with the UN system, as well as weaknesses or areas in which perhaps civil society could learn more about how to engage with the UN system and weaknesses of the UN system in responding. But you actually did shed a lot of light from the civil society perspective that no one else at the panel or probably in the room could have done. So I thank you for that. Because I don't think we have too much time, I know we were at least slated for an 8 o'clock close. I'm going to refrain from asking all the questions that I might ask as follow-up and turn right to the room. And I think, given the time, we'll maybe take 2 or 3 questions in a row, and then please address them if you can to one or more of the panelists specifically, and as other moderators have a tendency to say in this town, whatever you do say, please end with a question mark. We start over here. Identify yourself, please. Take a microphone, and then ask a question, and then we'll go to see if there are any others in the room before I turn to the panel. Okay?
My name is Anna. I work at the local National Affairs Office of the Church of Scientology International. My religion right now is quite persecuted in Russia. I wanted to thank Natalia and Ms. Mendelsohn specifically for speaking about civil society, because I feel like civil society is not being mentioned enough in these discussions about how we're going to deal with Russia. I think my question would mostly be directed at Mr. Wake and Ms. Mendelsohn as somebody who's had closest experience working with the UN and in the UN. As far as civil society goes, Russian civil society is excluded from policy-making process. However, behind every law, even a crazy law, there's always an expert that thought of it and always a lawyer that drafted it. I went to law school in Moscow, and in all of the years in law school, we studied nothing about the UN Declaration of Human Rights. There was nothing about it. I learned about it from a human rights program that our church sponsored. I had no idea about human rights at all as a lawyer, and it's not an unusual scene. And I'm wondering if there are initiatives that maybe I don't know about. Maybe there are programs in the UN or a plan to have a program to empower civil society in Russia, because Russian people and Russian government are not the same. I'm probably stating the obvious, but lawyers there are lacking education on human rights. And when the government commits atrocities, there's very little opposition within the country, not because Russian people are bad or they like what's going on. They just don't know. They don't have the resources or knowledge on how to oppose.
Other questions? See one here, and
hi, I'm Anthony Bucci, and again, don't want to be saying that when this is being recorded. No, but thank you all. This has been incredible to hear from all of you. As we were seeing here in the U.S., a lot of lot of policy throughout the government, obviously, is concentrated on what the whims of the leader, right, the president. And I'm curious how, particularly in Russia, how much of this is the Putin-Medvedev and that sort of we hear in the press about oligarchy and those folks, and how much could perhaps, if someone else were to come in, how quickly could reform happen
In Russia.
in Russia?
Who else? That's a question.
Anyone else? One more quick one, and then we'll do a.
So my name is Erica Rogers. I'm the director of a human rights education nonprofit called Youth for Human Rights. We actually specialize on actually educating young people on what the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is and how it applies to their life. So what I'd be curious to know is, one of the good things that I like that Anna mentioned is you have so many different, even people like lawyers who are supposed to be working on protecting the rights of citizens, not understanding or having that basic fundamental knowledge of those basic human rights. How do you see as one of the better strategies to be able to implement that kind of education, even at a ground-based level, kind of from that position, having experience, especially Ms. Mendelsohn, with the UN, as well as having a lot of experience there as well.
Anyone else? So the three questions relate to civil society and how members of civil society can better be informed about international human rights standards, if I understood it, with a particular focus on the legal profession in one case. A second question was how much current policy of the Russian Federation depends on its specific leadership today of the president, the prime minister, and those around them, and how much might change if personalities changed, if I'm understanding the question. And the third, which was, I think, closely related to the first, was about strategies for increasing understanding and
But also action. Like, how can civil society actually take action, especially in a country where civil society is not allowed to take action?
Okay, so I'm going to sit back as the moderator and see how others might wish to respond first. And I think we'll do that quickly to see if anyone on the panel would want to respond to each of the three questions. And unless there's another hand that goes up, we'll then do a quick round of any last comments, in particular if any of our panelists would like to respond to other panelists. So first, on the three questions, and then we may have a follow-up also. You want to go ahead and...
Well, it's a very different question, but I'm happy to...
All right, let's take the three questions quickly, then we'll turn to Victor, then we'll do the final wrap-up, if we can all do it in a kind of a lightning way. Exactly. So, on the three questions, who wants to jump in first? Sarah.
So I would argue colleagues who've worked for decades on human rights and rule of law in Russia would weep if they heard your questions, because they spent so much time engaging probably people a little bit older than you, and because of Putin's closing space, those organizations are no longer there. But there are good organizations still in Russia. In Moscow, Memorial has lots of expertise and experts. MPEGF, the Moscow Helsinki group, has lots of expertise. The Rule of Law Institute, ROLI, works around the world on rule of law issues. It's all on the web. I mean, you have lots of access and in Russian language as well. So that's a start. On the question of the ability to change quickly inside of Russia, I would say the damage that's been done to a lot of the nascent institutions is quite severe. The amount of corruption is very intense, so there are going to be a lot of people who are going to want to protect their assets, even if Putin were gone. But we do have faith and hope in a younger generation, particularly one that is so has a lot of antipathy around corruption. And those are people who come out for Mr. Navalny. I'm not advocating all of Mr. Navalny's stance, but there's a lot of energy, particularly around that corruption piece, and that's the only real sort of opening, plus the work that you were doing and what Eva is doing.
Others on, want to say something, Natalia, on this set of questions?
All the possible changes, but I believe that changes are inevitable in Russia. Putin's regime has its expiration date because it's just not effective. We of course don't know how and when it will happen. In 2012, when I forced to leave Russia, I was very hopeful about the future of my country because it was right after the huge wave of civil protests and demands for the changes, for free and fair elections, for dignity. They were not economic protests, they were for dignity. But later in 2014, when I was moving from Europe to the US, after this, in the middle of this Crimea and Ukraine crisis, I lost my hope a little bit because I didn't know even if it's my country any longer, if it's my people with all this support of Putin's actions in Crimea. But actually last year I returned this hope to my country. Well, first of all my work and the more and more I work with Russian inside the country, not being able to go there myself, but through partners, working with Russian youth, with Russian regions, the more and more I see that hope, I see this demand for changes. And last year we had outstanding youth protests, just inspired by Alexei Navalny and his anti-corruption movement. He posted a viral video about corruption of Dmitry Medvedev, and the protests were much bigger, on a much bigger scale geographically, from Vladivostok to Kaliningrad, even in the cities we call sleeping cities, never ever happened there before. But the most striking contrast with previous protests was this age of protesters from 13 years old to 22. And also, I think Putin and all he is on the top of this, of course. Medvedev is, I would say, irrelevant. He was just I don't know, iPhone holder and seat warmer this for years. But of course, it's not only Putin, it's all this police state, KGB state, different clans. Putin is more like a balancer between these clans. It's still strong, even with sanctions and with the economic situation, everything else still strong, still can survive some time. But what they really misjudged is they really invested billions into propaganda, into TV, only because Putin is quite an outdated dictator. He believed in the absolute power of television that made him, he was just a bored bureaucrat, and he became macho, like wrestling tigers, flying with birds, riding, driving tanks and so on. So he really believed that television is like everything. But with all these repressive laws on civil society, foreign agents, undesirable organizations, anything else, for me the biggest fear was the educational reform. Because the Russian authorities introduced more lessons of physical training, more lessons of Orthodox religion, of lessons of patriotism, and less cutting lessons on languages, mathematics and all that. It really seemed like the Russian state is just wants a generation of dumb soldiers. But what was really good news last year with Navalny's movement, to understand that Russian youth doesn't watch TV. And they don't take information from schools either. So I really am hopeful about the future of my country.
Victor.
Well, first of all, can I just switch over this? First of all, to thank the panel for the wonderful, I've really learned a lot from your experiences. Just wanted to say a couple of things before my question. The first one is, I think I've heard that I'm the only person getting this letter from Russia, which is a letter where they said, you're getting this letter to let you know that you'll never ever get a letter from us again. Felt like a lot of first dates that I've been in no time. But so the issue that I face is, of course, a flat rejection to engage, period. And so I've been thinking a lot in that relation, what could be avenues, if there's any at all, or there's simply no hope. And thinking about this, I've been reflecting on the fact of the inter-American experience, where at the OAS we have the quote-unquote strengthening process. And you had the great disruptors, Venezuela, Nicaragua, the whole ALBA bloc, who were really appeared to break the system, but you always know that they were stopped just short of breaking it, because there seems to be a usefulness of having a system to disrupt. And so what I was hoping to get your take on is whether this is the same situation and whether that in itself is an opening to try and keep on engaging. Because it does seem to me that it would be possible for any of these actors to really go ahead and break the system. And in that vein, and I apologize for bringing what is probably a complex question, but I'm of course trying to understand what the announcement by Mr. Bolton on the defunding of the human rights work of the United Nations, of the Office of the High Commissioner, is going to mean in this equation. And what's your opinion about that? Thank you very much. And I'll give you back the mic.
I think this should be, I think this should be a lightning round of quick responses to Victor. And can someone tell me, do we have 5-10 minutes more in the room, or do we need to be out right literally at 8 o'clock? Are we okay?
Yeah.
All right, let's do a lightning response to Victor and then closing comments by anyone who has anything else they want to say.
I think we should
Do it all at the same time. All right, let's do it that way. All right. We'll go left to right.
Very brief. On your question, I think we've seen cases where governments absolutely refuse to cooperate, but then they, in the end, because of other dynamics that come to play and tremendous amount of pressure. So I'm thinking North Korea, for example, where the international community was so united against the human rights situation and created a commission of inquiry that released a very hard-hitting report. And eventually, you got reports that North Korean diplomats started cooperating. And they also created a field office in South Korea to take testimonies from North Korean refugees. So you might look at the North Korea case as an example. You could also figure out ways of interacting with Russian activists, either, I don't know if you're into Russia, but on the margins of the Russian borders, if there's some meetings outside of Russia where they're gathered, to give them a voice and an opportunity to have an official meeting with them. Maybe you have to decide whether it's useful to have cameras in the room. If that's helpful to them, you'll have to consult with civil society to see if that would be helpful, but that's one way of working that. Finally, I would say the U.S., this has not been the focus of this discussion, but we have to really think hard about the U.S. policy. That relates to your question. You probably know the answer on the funding, but it's a whole attitude that John Bolton represents, which is we don't believe in the UN telling us what to do, period. And it's perfect out of the Russian and Chinese script. That's exactly what they said. So we have a real problem right now. We're heading into a real trough, and I'm very concerned about the position of my own government.
3 quick points. In terms of democracy, human rights, and governance funding, the U.S. has been the largest bilateral donor traditionally, so it's extremely important, and Congress decides that money, not the executive branch. So it is imperative that people let both Paul Warren and Tim Reeser, the staffers on the Hill that work on this, that this is still important. 2, my sense is, I thought you were going to address this, I think Russia is interested in breaking the international order. China is not. There's a way in which there's a very different sense of this, and people who have wildly different views of Russia come to that opinion, but people who are dealing with China a lot. And I want to say, focus on folks who are in exile. There's a ton. The donor community should be focused on this. This is for not only LGBT community, but in general. We're in the presence of one person. We don't have a strategic approach to supporting them.
Please.
On the letter that was sent, they may stick to their position, but that doesn't mean you have to stick to their position. And in that situation, regularly, if you get information, it's rather difficult because the privacy issues. I've asked different NGOs about advocacy on this with regard to Russia, and more often than not, they say, don't say anything because we don't want to get people into trouble, more trouble. But to the extent you have information, I would bombard them with it, and then you post it on your website, or you put it in your report, and you make and you keep the record there. I think that that's actually important to continue doing. On the funding issue, let me talk about that for a minute. I actually visited the State Department this afternoon before I came over here, because I don't get to Washington that often.
Right.
And because I'm hearing different things in Geneva. In Geneva, I'm hearing we're going to continue our engagement with the Office of the High Commissioner, we're going to continue our involvement with the treaty bodies, we're going to continue the things we fund. Okay? And Bolton now 3 times has stated we're going to defund the Human Rights Council and the Office of the High Commission. He stated it on Fox and Friends right immediately after Nikki Haley said we're out. He stated it in Israel on his visit there. This was reported. He may have said it elsewhere, but these are the ones that were reported. And he stated it on Monday, using the same language. But in Monday, he stated it in response to a question. It wasn't part of his cleared speech, obviously. And the indications I get is that this is Bolton being Bolton. This is his personal vendetta, and this is the way he wants to see it. Now, he is in an important position, and he may be right. So I asked at State, and I did not meet with, I met with middle-level people, and that was deliberate. What's going to really happen on this? And they recall the pattern where the U.S. sends its assessed contribution, but says don't use this for these particular purposes, and that they said that they wouldn't fund the portion that goes to the Human Rights Council. But as far as everything else is concerned, number one, the money that goes to the Torture Victims Fund comes from Congress, and it's a separate law, and it's basically not touchable. Number two, when the administration said last year that they were not going to fund UN voluntary activities and other agencies and so forth, the Congress reversed it as a bipartisan measure on both sides. So I may be crazy, but we're all expecting some changes in the House of Representatives in the elections in 6 or 7 weeks. And it's the House of Representatives that initiates the funding issues. I mean, they're the leader on that. And if that happens, then I think, based on the fact that, number one, there was bipartisan reversal of it last time, that this might happen again now. How to stop it? It's very important that the congressional language not reference mandatory cuts, that it leave open options. And quite frankly, we've seen it before, and so I think there is an openness on that. At the same time, the people told me, of course, we're going to be continuing the Columbia project that they fund through the High Commissioner's office, the Torture Victims Fund, because there's nothing they can do about that except if Congress cuts it off, and other such things. So I think that it's not as bad as it sounded. I think that Bolton needs to be isolated. I think the UN Foundation, which is the organization, the umbrella organization that UNA is a part of, has been very much on top of this issue of congressional funding, and should continue to be on this. And I think that it's more fluid and open than we think. But don't expect the U.S. To just say, oh yeah, we're going to send all our money over there. They're going to target it more than they did. This is what we saw in the Reagan administration. This is what we saw in the Bush 43. They're going to target it more. They're going to say we're going to only fund the things that are in our interest. I specifically posed the question of North Korea and the COI. Are you going to support the North Korean resolutions? you know, and so forth. And I was told, yes, yes, of course, you know, there's no question about that. So I think things are a lot more fluid than Mr. Bolton likes to make it sound.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for this panel. It's really, I don't know how about you, I really learned a lot today. Thank you for your interest to Russia. It's the country I love, the country I miss, the country I want back. And some Russian pro-democracy activists and journalists and so on called us the informal embassy of Russian pro-democracy forces here in Washington, D.C. And when I bring them to different offices, the Hill, the state, and so on, and when they are asked the question, what the West can do for you, they always say, nothing. We Russians, we are responsible for reforms, for changes inside the country. What we really ask from you is stand on your principles and really understand who you are dealing with, and don't let them undermine your procedures, your institutions, your democracies. And really, it's important for the UN and any other institutions, governments, not to be naive about Putin's Russia and hope that there are any effective ways to engage it. Even more importantly, to have a common, very well laid out strategy on how to deal with it instead of just reacting to newspaper headlines. And probably containment would be more effective with Putin's regime. Push back everywhere you can. So contain the regime, engage Russian civil society, and inform Russian youth. I'm really very interested in your program, Sarah. Maybe we can somehow be a part of it and learn from it. So thank you so much.
I will conclude with just a couple of words, because it would be foolhardy to try to summarize, and it would be imprudent for me to suggest that I can offer some new view on one or another of these questions that hasn't been offered by others. I think we have had really rich discussion, and maybe the only kind of opinion-related remark that I would make at the end would be a kind of misquote of I think it was Doug Hammarskjöld, the Secretary General, who said that if the UN hadn't existed, it would have to if there weren't a UN, or if it disappeared today, we'd have to invent a new one. I think with regard to the UN work on human rights, we've heard about all kinds of weaknesses and all kinds of ways in which one member state of the UN that has been the main focus of our attention can be a disruptor or a breaker, and we've heard about some real serious issues relating to the policies of the country that we all live in right now toward the UN and its human rights work. But if the UN didn't exist and it didn't do human rights work, someone would have to come up with a multilateral organization on a global scale to address these issues. And with all its imperfections, we have an awful lot of scope for engagement, both at the governmental and the non-governmental level. And I think now, speaking as someone who's at least spent some time with this UN association work, I think it's incumbent on those of us who care about both human rights and multilateralism to try to look for ways to engage and improve these mechanisms rather than attack and storm and strip away. So I conclude with that, and thank my colleagues on the panel very much, as well as UNA NCA colleagues, and especially AJC for hosting and providing this.